Welcome to Coffee with Kish. Hi, this is Kish, and we're here again to geek out about Mormonism. Today I'm going to provide you with a brief movie review, and it's kind of picking up on a series that started with the Interpreter Foundation's Witnesses, a story about the witnesses for the Book of Mormon. Now, I actually really liked this film. I know there are a lot of critics of the LDS Church and Mormonism who didn't really care for it a lot, but I thought Witnesses was a really entertaining film. Not perfect, not Academy Award-winning cinema by any means, but solidly done. Perfect, no, but entertaining certainly, and I thought this was a story that a lot of Mormons would like to see. So now we have 6 Days in August, the sort of follow-up on this film, and according to one of the executive producers, Daniel Peterson, who's one of the founders of the Interpreter Foundation, an apologetic organization that picks up where the old Foundation of Ancient Research and Mormon Studies, also known as FARMS, kind of left off, carrying on with their publications, their book reviews, and their other work. And cinema became a new way for them to tell a faith-affirming story about Mormonism, and I'm really glad that they went this route because it wasn't being done, and when it was being done by the church, you just get these little short films. I thought they were kind of, sometimes kind of hokey, not all bad. Some of them were actually kind of close to the Interpreter Foundation films in their quality and scope, but Witnesses, in telling the story of the Book of Mormon Witnesses, did a really fine job of portraying an LDS view of what it must have been like to be one of the witnesses and to observe Joseph Smith's career, including the assassination. I found Oliver Cowdery's story especially interesting and compelling. He really provides the larger framework for the movie, his personal story. Daniel Peterson, when he decided to do 6 Days in August, was responding to what he thought was a clear need to defend the LDS Church's claims to authority. Because when Joseph Smith was assassinated in June of 1844, there was a succession crisis, and no one really knew exactly where to turn for leadership. And frankly, this was as much Joseph Smith's own fault as it was anyone's, because if you dig into the history at all, you'll see that there were lots of different possibilities that Joseph Smith opened up, explored, tested out a little bit. One of these included even a lineal succession through his family, and that's what ended up being the leadership model for many years for the Midwestern Mormons, the Community of Christ, earlier known as the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were those who formed around Emma and her son Joseph III, who became, as Joseph Smith's son, his successor, following up on the possibility that the church would always stay in the Smith family. And there's a pretty good argument for that. I think one of the arguments is that the LDS Church, under the leadership of Brigham Young, that went out west and settled in Utah and colonized much of the West, they kept a church patriarch who was a Smith. And that was the case up into my lifetime, but up to the 1980s, that remained a Smith descendant, a descendant of Joseph Smith's brother Hiram. The LDS Church obviously doesn't follow this model of lineal succession through the Smith family, even though they had a church patriarch for a long time. Instead, this is the church that was founded by Brigham Young and the other apostles. And I say that deliberately because, in a sense, the church as it had existed under Joseph Smith really ceased to exist. You know, the saints tried to regroup under different leaders, including Lyman White, who went out and colonized Texas, and including the Strangites, who went to Michigan, and including the Reorganites that gathered around, as I said before, Emma. Now, Stephen Shields, who has really, I think, made the best case for this, looks at these as all new churches that find their origins in the church organized by Joseph Smith. And that view isn't really popular with the LDS folk, who of course want to think that they have the one true version of Mormonism. They are the true organization and simply a continuation of Joseph Smith's church. But I don't think that withstands scrutiny if you look at it from a certain point of view. I don't really want to get into the details here because I want to talk about the movie. In any case, Brigham Young is not generally viewed as a sympathetic character. Go figure. And I'll tell you why. Because he was kind of a rough man, and he could often be very blunt, even ruthless in getting his way. There were these t-shirts that they used to sell back in the days when I was at Brigham Young University that had a picture of Brigham Young, you know, the older Brigham Young with his beard and his very stern, forbidding looks, and a quote next to it that said, "You can go to Provo or go to hell." And we, of course, thought that was funny, but it also captured something of the spirit of Brigham Young, that, you know, he's a very authoritarian type figure. And he really did almost serve as a theocratic dictator type of person in Utah. And he was trying to really set up the kingdom of God, an earthly kingdom of God, with himself as the leader of that kingdom that other people had to obey. Yeah, he's also really associated with the full flowering of Mormon polygamy, which is something about the history of Mormonism that makes it especially controversial and gives it a lasting bad reputation. So Brigham is associated with that authoritarianism. He's heavily associated with polygamy, theocracy. He looks like a kind of negative dude, a sour bully almost. He was a sharp businessman. In sharp, I mean not always fair, I would say, or at least others accused him of being unfair in business. He was, by the standards of his day, incredibly wealthy because the church that he founded made him extremely wealthy. There are lots of reasons why people might not like Brigham Young. Now, the Interpreter Foundation is, of course, really aware of this, and they see this as a problem because today's LDS leaders, of course, trace their authority back to Brigham Young's arrangement that the 12 apostles, the missionary force that Joseph Smith had created to travel abroad to foreign countries, preach the gospel, and bring converts back to the saints that were gathered by Joseph Smith. You know, these guys become the center of LDS ecclesiology and ecclesiastical structure. They are the leaders, and today they are the leaders. Sometimes critics call them disparagingly the 15 because the president of the church is one of the apostles. He's chosen from the apostles, and the eldest member of the 12 apostles is the one who becomes the leader of the church when a prophet, president of the church, dies. Well, that's an arrangement that Joseph Smith didn't come up with. That's an arrangement that came about through what has been called the apostolic coup, in the words of Radio Free Mormon, of the Mormon Church. But I would say, maybe a little less provocatively, just the sort of Brighamite apostolic structure of the LDS Church. And so this is the motivation for having this movie that I would say romanticizes in not in very over-the-top ways. So sometimes it gets a little bit over the top, but it tries to, in a really classy, polished way, provide a defense of Brigham Young's calling by God to lead the saints, to carry on Joseph Smith's work, and thereby prop up or affirm and support, maybe more positively put, the authority of the LDS apostles who run the LDS Church today. Is it effective? Well, I think in certain ways the plot of the movie isn't effective, in that it's really made for people who know the history pretty well. It jumps backward and forward in time. Brigham in the past and later on basically looks the same. So if you don't know what's going on, you can get pretty easily confused. At the opening of the movie, Brigham Young perform a miracle. And this is one of the things this film is trying to do. It's trying to take the image that people have of Brigham Young as just this sort of dour, harsh, brutal, authoritarian figure who was just a good organizer, and sort of tear that away and then reveal this underlying Brigham, who is a very sympathetic, charismatic man of God who works miracles. Well, what's the miracle? The film opens with Brigham and some of the other apostles traveling by coach through this road in the woods, and they come across this ox cart that's stuck. And they're already having trouble with the driver, who's not being very accommodating. And I'm talking about the driver of the stagecoach right now. He wants this ox cart out of the way right now. The driver of the ox cart is really impatient, and he wants to go beat the animals to get them to move. And then suddenly Brigham takes control of the situation. He just exerts this quiet authority. He gets off the stagecoach and he gently approaches the animal, and the other brethren say, let him do what he's going to do. Let's see what happens. And he starts speaking in tongues. This is not a Brigham we know, right? I mean, if you know the history really well, it is a Brigham you know. Brigham was really into speaking in tongues, and he was partly attracted to the Mormon movement because speaking of tongues was manifest in this group. And so he felt that, yes, here are the miracles that attend the saints as is declared in the New Testament, right? And it's successful. Brigham Young's miracle is successful. The oxen move past the impediment. The wheels of the ox cart were caught behind some kind of piece of wood or giant root in this sort of muddy, puddly patch. But through Brigham Young's speaking in tongues, and the speaking in tongues, I say, sounds a little bit like maybe Aramaic or something. It really seems to me that the makers of the film wanted it to sound like this genuine, not something like you would see on a television evangelist speaking in tongues and in a real jarring and hyper-energetic way. No, Brigham's is soft. His speaking in tongues sounds almost like a real language. Is it a real language? I don't know. I know about Aramaic, but I can't really say that I know know what Aramaic sounds like, or that I even listened that closely. I watched the movie just once. But this becomes an important theme in the film. This is not the last time that Brigham Young will speak in tongues. And why is that important? Because the key scene in the entire movie is the passing of the mantle of Joseph Smith to Brigham Young after Joseph Smith's assassination at a meeting where Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young were facing off in a way to see who would lead the church going forward. Sidney Rigdon proposed that he would be the guardian of the church to carry on Joseph's work, but he wouldn't replace Joseph Smith. And Brigham Young was saying, we the apostles, he presented the sort of group solution with these apostles to provide firm leadership after Joseph Smith's assassination. Now, I can think of many reasons why Brigham Young's solution would be successful in practical terms without a miracle. Number one, Sidney had been marginalized from the leader of the church, even though he remained technically in the first presidency. The Brigham Young and group were definitely in the good graces of Joseph Smith before he passed away. These were, at least some of them, including Brigham Young. Like Brigham Young had been the sort of Mark Antony to Joseph Smith's Julius Caesar. And the idea of having a group, this group of solid, faithful, loyal saints, rather than this lone Sidney Rigdon figure, who, by all accounts, after the attempted tar and, well, not attempted, the actually achieved tar and feathering of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon years before, he'd never been quite the same after that. He had injured his head and supposedly not quite what he had been before. So I don't even really think that the miracle was necessary, but the miracle definitely was the icing on the cake. Now, what is the evidence for the miracle? I think there's some evidence that people believe that Brigham Young took on the appearance of Joseph Smith, the dead Joseph Smith, in this meeting, that he was transfigured, in a sense, to become Joseph Smith. And in the movie, this is handled in a blunt force way by having the actor who plays Joseph Smith simply replace the actor who plays Brigham Young on the stand and have everybody in the congregation go, wow, yes, it's him, it's Joseph, this is Joseph. I don't really think that this super dramatic way is justified by the historical sources. I think it was probably a lot more subtle when it happened. And I think there is some indication that Brigham Young may have attempted to appear like Joseph Smith. Like one of the accounts says that, oh, he gestured like Joseph Smith gestured. Well, he could non-miraculously, Brigham Young could certainly non-miraculously gesture like Joseph Smith. He sounded like Joseph Smith. Well, Brigham Young was known to impersonate people's voices. So it's possible that he deliberately, or maybe subconsciously, took on the mantle of Joseph Smith. He played the part of Joseph Smith and thus won some people over who noticed that they could see somehow, in some sense, Joseph Smith in Brigham Young. Now, I'm not one, as a historian, simply to dismiss miracles. I don't think it's my job as a historian to affirm or disaffirm miracles. I do think it's my job to recognize that there were certainly people who say they experienced this. That was their perception at the time. And I think it does help explain something of why people felt reassured that Brigham Young and the 12 were the solution. And, that this moment is crucial in the transition from Joseph Smith's movement to the movement that was started by Brigham Young and the Apostles, which eventually became the very successful LDS Church. And I think Brigham Young deserves a lot of credit for that, for all of his limitations. And personally, I admit, I am really no fan of Brigham Young. The film does a magnificent job, though, in making Brigham Young seem like a sympathetic person. Maybe one would argue that it's even a whitewashing job. A more charitable view of it, or maybe even a fairer view of it, would be that it's bringing out aspects of Brigham Young's personality and history that balance out the image that we have of the mid to late 19th century Brigham Young, who's this big, foreboding looking character that you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley. I think there's quite a bit of skill that went into making this happen and carrying this message through the plot. And one of the ways I think this argument in favor of Brigham Young was made really has a lot to do with this really strange, almost devaluation of Joseph Smith, or at least part of Joseph Smith's legacy. Through the course of the film, and I think the makers of the film are to be commended for this, they don't really hide from some of the more controversial aspects of what was going on in Nauvoo, especially with polygamy, the destruction of the press of the Nauvoo Expositor. All of these things are dealt with, but I mean, they're mentioned. There's a certain weird, dreamy distance, I think, between a lot of the historical action in the film. It lacks a kind of urgency because I think it's, in a sense, this is still hagiography. Everything has to be told in a way that's very sympathetic. And yet, if you're not LDS, you can't help but see something of almost and I use this word with caution, but what popularly is thought, and I don't always think correctly or rightly thought of, as a cult leader in Joseph Smith. And so Joseph is attached very clearly to all of these problematic things. Joseph Smith is dressed like a general, so this sort of militaristic Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith is the one dealing with his wife who's sad that he's practicing polygamy because he claims that God told him to. Joseph Smith is the one who's held responsible for destroying the press of the Nauvoo Expositor. Brigham Young is, it's not like he has no contact with these things, but he's really kind of off somewhere on the periphery. And so I would say the Brigham of this film is almost a Brigham that never existed, in that, Brigham Young, the real Brigham Young, is certainly on board with everything that Joseph Smith is doing. He's Joseph Smith's most fervent and loyal supporter in everything, I would say. But the impression the film gives is there creates a weird space between these characters. The negative aspects of Joseph Smith's legacy instead in the film are very much associated with the figure of Sidney Rigdon. So it's Sidney who represents the more troubling aspects of Joseph Smith's legacy, and I think this is really carried out in the film, or it really gels in the film in the scene of the tar and feathering of Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Whatever was intended by it, you can't help but remember that here are these two characters together who are tarred and feathered. And because it's not really well explained and well integrated into the plot, you're just left with that sort of iconic negative image of these guys who were treated in this way. And, the lizard brain is going to think, well, if these guys did something. Something is up with these guys. And, that impression lives on in Sidney Rigdon even after Joseph Smith has been assassinated. When he's giving his final speech, his pitch to be guardian of the church, you see the chaotic, the violent, the overly exuberant Sidney Rigdon, and at least I, as a viewer, associated it with this one Joseph, this troubled Joseph that you don't quite trust. And then there's the Joseph Smith of Brigham Young, and he's a different Joseph Smith film. The positive, reassuring Joseph Smith first appears when Brigham Young and Joseph first meet face to face. And they have this, good-spirited rivalry and seeing who can chop down a tree first. And Joseph wins just barely, and they pat each other's shoulders in a manly way, and they're laughing and having a good time. That's Brigham's Joseph, I would say. Brigham's Joseph also is made in these glossolalia or speaking in tongue scenes to look admiringly at Brigham as he's singing this very sort of sweetly melancholy, spiritual, almost Middle Eastern tune with his speaking in tongues. And so this is important, vitally important, because it's depicting Brigham Young as a charismatic figure whose charisma, independent of Joseph Smith, is respected and held in awe by the Brigham Young Joseph Smith. Okay, so the final face-off is, I would say, a face-off between these two legacies of Joseph Smith. When Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young make their two opposing arguments for who should lead the church going forward, Sidney's up there making his case, and miraculously a wind sweeps in, drowns out his rather shrill and more high-pitched and squeaky voice. And you can clearly see that the filmmakers want to get across the point that this is the option that's doomed to fail. That's the bad Joseph of the past. And then there is Brigham Young, who comes up with a commanding presence, a calming presence, and then boom, Joseph Smith appears before their eyes, and he looks beatific, and he's glowing, and he's smiling, and everyone is just really happy and assured, yes, this is Joseph. This is what we're supposed to do. We follow Brigham's Joseph. They see one Joseph here, but the film really splits Joseph. And there's the troubling Joseph, the Joseph that leads up to this assassination. Then there is the Brigham Joseph that's set aside, that exists in this space of calm, of charismatic gifts, of gentle command. I think that there's actually a much better film to be had in the film that was produced, and yet I can't help but respect what was done here, and yet I don't think that the filmmakers would want you to get the idea that there is any sort of culty Joseph. They just see Joseph. This is the Interpreter Foundation, fully in support of the LDS Church's view of Joseph Smith, a very positive view of Joseph Smith, a very positive view of Brigham Young. It's those of us who don't share that viewpoint necessarily, who see these things, and I think there's some justification, for seeing them. We're coming out of the same culture, but we're coming out of the non-LDS oriented part of the culture. And when we see religious leaders who dress up in military garb and marry lots of women and destroy, get into conflict with the free press, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what are people going to think? What are non-LDS people going to think? This is the bad Joseph, right? This is the bad Joseph. The good Joseph is Brigham Young's Joseph. And the sort of the meta level of this, which I also find extremely fascinating, is that if you think about it, this is the very transition that the LDS Church wants to make. The LDS Church doesn't want to really carry the albatross of the anti-Mormon views that started in Joseph Smith's lifetime. Well, they endure today. Read Terrell Given's work. Excellent work, his scholarship on anti-Mormonism. It begins then, and it carries through to today, and it's a lot of it's the same stuff. A lot of the anti-Mormon material really hasn't changed. Well, I think in the films, in 6 Days in August, Brigham Young, we see what the LDS Church wants to be today. And that is portrayed through this idealized or much more positive view of Brigham Young. He's found, I think, in the historical evidence to a certain degree, but this is surely a slice of Brigham Young who's brought forward for a very particular sort of propagandistic purpose, or a faith-affirming purpose if you're coming at it from an LDS point of view. Well, that's it. That's Coffee with Kish, and I enjoyed 6 Days in August. I'd recommend it. I say go see it. You may completely disagree what I've had to say with what I've had to say about it. It's not a hostile review. It's my review as someone who's not currently an LDS person, but someone who has a deep ties to and a great deal of affection for the Mormon tradition. And I recognize that this is someone's interpretation of the life of Brigham Young and someone's interpretation of the succession. We don't have to fully accept it. We don't have to knee-jerk reject it. But I do think it's just fun to watch and interesting, fascinating. There's a lot of fodder for reflection and interpretation as I've done here. So thank you for joining me on Coffee with Kish to geek out about 6 Days in August. Take care and see you next time. Please like and subscribe.